Hello, everyone. I just wanted to thank you for joining this event here today that we will be having discussing the situation in Myanmar and its connection to the ATT. We really appreciate all of your taking your time to join us here today. As you have seen from the flyer, we do have several set of panelists that will be contributing to this conversation, and we will also have a question and answer session where you can submit your questions to the panelists, and we will collect those and ask those on the video. The question, if you would like to submit a question, please do so using the question and answer function. And we will get to those at the end of the speakers. Just to introduce myself, my name is Cindy Ebbs. I am an acting co-director of Control Arms. And again, I welcome you here today. Many of us are just arriving to this event from working group meetings that are relating to the implementation of the Arms Trade Treaty, a multilateral instrument with 110 states parties that seeks to regulate the global arms trade and reduce human suffering. We've spent part of this week discussing how states parties can implement their obligations under the ATT, in particular, its prohibitions set out in Article 6 and the required risk assessments in Article 7 that seek to ensure that arms transferred will not be used to commit or facilitate serious violations of international human rights law. Now we will turn to the situation in Myanmar. Violence against the Rohingya Muslim minority escalated steadily between 2012 and 2017, culminating in a military crackdown in October 2016, resulting in over 6,700 people killed, including 730 children, and forced over 600,000 Rohingya to flee their homes. The February 1, 2021 military coup has deprived the people of Myanmar of the right to democratically elect their government. Subsequently, the junta has increasingly used excessive and at times lethal force at demonstrations, threatened and arbitrarily detained activists, journalists, students, and civil servants, and imposed rolling internet shutdowns that put lives at risk. While the international community has taken notice, it has yet to come together to take concerted action. A number of UN member states and regional organizations have imposed a variety of sanctions, and in some cases, an arms embargo. However, the United Nations Security Council has taken no action with regard to Myanmar to date. The ATT provides a framework for states parties to prohibit the transfer of weapons in situations of genocide, crimes against humanity, and grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, among others. It also requires states parties to examine through the lens of international human rights law the transfers of conventional weapons that are exported from, transited through, or imported into their territory. States parties are obligated to both implement and uphold this framework to reduce human suffering. Given their collective commitment, ATT states parties have an opportunity to lead on action in Myanmar. We hope this event provides more information on the situation and encourages you to support efforts to end the violence. I will now turn my screen over to Ambassador Sangbam Lim of the Republic of Korea. Ambassador Lim is the chair of the working group on effective implementation and to share his opening remarks. Ambassador Lim, you have the screen. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cindy, for giving me the opportunity. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, everyone. At the outset, I would like to thank the organizers, Control Arms and Amnesty International, for preparing this event and for inviting me. My name is Sangbam Lim, as introduced, chair of the UGT Working Group on Effective Treaty Implementation of the Arms Trade Treaty. I also thank all the participants after a long working group discussion this afternoon. As we are well aware, the Arms Trade Treaty, which they entered into force in December 2014, is the first international instrument regulating the global transfer of conventional arms, including small arms and light weapons. The treaty's inception was triggered by concerns over the disruptive effects of unregulated arms trade on people's lives. As the treaty indicates, its object is to establish the highest possible common standards for the regulation of the international trade in conventional arms and the prevention of their illicit trade. And the purpose is to contribute to international and regional peace, security, and stability, and reducing human suffering. ATT commit states to regulate arms transfers in compliance with their respective obligations under the UN Charter, international human rights law, and international humanitarian law, in particular obligations regarding transfers of arms, the risk assessment, and prevention of divergence set out in Articles 6, 7, and 11. Over the years, through discussions in the Working Group on Effective Treaty Implementation, state parties and other stakeholders have shared their respective practices and interpretation of these articles, deepened understanding of relevant criteria, and accumulated practical knowledge and information among states. Of course, there is still a long way to go, but so far we have made significant progress. However, at the end of the day, the most important thing is whether or not the ATT contributes to making a difference on the ground. In this regard, I believe the current situation in Myanmar, along with other cases of armed conflict, is putting to the test of a hard-won effectiveness of the treaty in achieving its purpose in the field. Therefore, faithful implementation of the treaty obligations by state parties, bearing in mind the treaty's humanitarian purpose and object, is all the more important and relevant. As the chair of the UGT, I believe this event will serve as a reaffirmation of the importance of responsible transfers of arms by state parties and other stakeholders of the ATT in regard to the current situation in Myanmar. I also believe continued and concerted efforts made by the international community towards the right direction will certainly reduce the harm caused by irresponsible arms transfers. Lastly, I want to thank again the host of this event and wish them great success. I am sure that today's discussion will reaffirm the importance of the implementation of the ATT and provide a platform to discuss ways to alleviate human sufferings in Myanmar. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Lim, for your remarks and for joining us here today. Your leadership role in the ATT implementation is really greatly appreciated, and we look forward to continuing work with you in the run-up to the ATT CSP 7. Next, I will now turn to our next speaker. I have the privilege of introducing you to a pre-recorded video address given by Mr. Jose Ramos Horta. Mr. Ramos Horta is a Nobel Peace Prize co-recipient and former president of Timor-Leste. Mr. Ramos Horta himself will outline his background and will discuss the current situation in Myanmar, and as well as opportunities for international and regional action to end the violence. If you'll bear with me one moment, I'll share my screen and start the video. Thank you.
Distinguished envoys, ambassadors, representatives, esteemed members of civil society, in particular, those representing the voices of the people of Myanmar. This is Jose Ramos Horta speaking from Dili, Timor-Leste. I am a former president, prime minister, foreign minister, and in the past, I also served as Undersecretary General and the Special Envoy of the Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, for Guinea-Bissau. My long engagement with the United Nations, either as a simple, humble, unknown member of our movement of struggle for self-determination independence, lobbying at the United Nations and around the world, and in particular the UN Human Rights Commission, when it was called Human Rights Commission, and the other subsidiary bodies of the UN human rights system. I therefore have a deep understanding of United Nations, of realpolitik, and the limitation of the UN, but also of the possibilities, and in particular of the multilateral responsibility that the institutions, multilateral institutions, owe to the people they are supposed to serve. It is high time for the United Nations at this time to speak forcefully in condemning the coup that occurred in Myanmar on February 1st by the military junta. This is not the first time that the military in Myanmar orchestrated a coup, arrest leaders to deny the people their voice, their legitimate leaders. This is not the first time that the military in Myanmar showed themselves to be prone to orchestrate widespread, systematic, targeted, indiscriminated killings of anyone that opposes them, whether members of the national ethnic communities or intellectuals, academics, and now standing to youth, to women, to children, and to all those who today in Myanmar, from bankers to civil servants, to academics, to medical doctors, to artists, to dancers, who, representing the overwhelming majority of the people, are opposing the Burmese military coup to deny them, the people, their legitimate representatives. So I'm speaking with emotion, with heart, but also with deep understanding of the extraordinary difficulties ASEAN leaders are facing in dealing with this problem. And I understand the extraordinary difficulties for other countries in the region that are impacted by the problems in Myanmar, particularly China, India, and Bangladesh, to mention only those non-ASEAN member states, but that share borders, important borders with Myanmar. Nevertheless, it is important that when there is a military coup, there is a condemnation of the coup. We cannot mince words. We cannot disguise. If the coup had happened in Africa, the country concerned would see its membership in the African Union suspended. The leaders involved in the coup would be automatically sanctioned. And this shows how Asia is so much lagging behind the African Union, the Organization of Latin American States, and not to mention the European Union. There has been hardly condemnation of the coup in Myanmar by Asian leaders. I praise Malaysia and Indonesia for taking the leadership in trying to realize, to give meaning to the claim of ASEAN centrality, to give meaning, substance, feeling to what is called, it should be, ASEAN community of peoples. Peoples are being killed, are being denied their right to elect their own leaders in absolute freedom, and yet there is a deafening silence in Asia. When we do not condemn a coup, we set precedent. If a coup is acceptable in Myanmar, it will be accepted elsewhere in the ASEAN region and beyond. There cannot be recognition of the military group that have installed itself. There has to be continuing recognition of the elected leaders, now grouped under the interim government and interim parliament, together with all ethnic nationalities that hopefully for the first time after decades of denying their even existence, their role, their right to be heard and to be engaged in the decision making in regard to the future of the common country, Myanmar. Finally, the interim parliament, the interim government, with a new federal state constitution recognizing the full rights of ethnic nationalities. That's the only way for Myanmar to achieve lasting peace and prosperity. There has to be comprehensive arms embargo against Myanmar. It is immoral, unacceptable that every time there is a major conflict, and in the midst of this pandemic, COVID-19, and in the midst of this global recession that has thrown into poverty hundreds of millions of people around the world, the only industries that have not suffered from COVID-19 and from the global economic recession are the armed industries. Conventional weapons are the weapons that have been fueling and killing people in Yemen. Hundreds of thousands, including tens of thousands of children, hospitals destroyed by conventional weapons, delivered to Saudi Arabia, enabling the war in Yemen to continue. And this has been done by almost all major countries, weapon-producing countries. The conflict in Libya, the conflict in Syria, the spillover of the conflict in Libya with weapons pouring into Mali. Well, the weapon-producing countries are harvesting what they have sowed over the years, disregarding ethics and morality, considering only above all how much the weapons that they sell contribute to jobs in their countries and to their GDP. Member states today meeting in Geneva on the margins of the Arms Trade Treaty, and for those who are producing and export to observe the code of conduct that almost 20 Nobel Peace Prize laureates in 1997, of which I was a member, we drafted, we agreed on to inspire, to guide weapons producing countries in their transactions with countries that violate human rights, countries in conflict, regions in conflict. That code of conduct that we agreed upon in 1997 was a mild one. It was not a radical, and yet it has been diluted to the current arms trade agreement. So we appeal to all of you to forcefully honor this and to show consistency with the arms trade agreement by freezing all weapons deliveries to Myanmar, regardless of whether there has been a previous contract with Myanmar. Any contracts with Myanmar of any nature must be frozen until the democracy is restored, elected leaders are released, until Aung San Suu Kyi, the president, and others are released, until there is substantive dialogue between the military and the elected leaders. Yes, there has to be recognition that the military have a role in Myanmar, but a role that is assigned to them in a democratic constitution, a role that is mandated to them by elected governments. They are the ones who should overrule over the military. Having said that, I wish to thank civil society members in Geneva for hosting this side event on Myanmar, and to extend my appreciation to all of you who over the years stood by the Timorese people in our struggle for freedom and democracy. I thank you. God bless you all.
Thank you, everyone, for your attention to that powerful address by Mr. Ramos Horta. With that, I will now introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Ms. Huenin Puinton. Huenin is a Switzerland-based Burmese human rights defender working in research, advocacy, and campaign-focused roles with the non-governmental organizations Burma Campaign UK and Advance Myanmar. Huenin works with human rights defenders and organizations inside Burma to coordinate advocacy and international campaign actions. Huenin will give a brief background on the current situation in Myanmar, including violence against protesters, arrests, torture, death, and attack in ethnic areas. Then she'll move on to discuss the use of sanctions and arms embargoes to address the violence and the importance of accountability with regard to the recent military coup, as well as violations against the Rohingya. Huenin, you have the screen. Thank you.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. It's my privilege to be here to discussing this important issue. In my presentation, I hope to amplify the voices from inside the country. As we all know, on 1st of February, Myanmar and the Burmese military staged a coup, taking control of the government, arresting NLD officials, including Aung San Suu Kyi and President Wilkin. At the same time, he thought if he arrested civil society leaders, activists, and other influential leaders, he could stop protests. He thought he could stop people from mobilizing. But what we are seeing is the biggest protest in the past 30 years. And we are seeing one of the biggest civil disobedience movements in my country's history. And we saw that when the protest started in early February, peaceful protesters were offering water and flowers to police and security forces, encouraging them to join in with the civil disobedience movement and encouraging them to join in fighting for military coup. And young people and women are the forefront of these protests. And it's very heartwarming to see amazing creativity as people find different ways to resist military rules. People from different ethnicity, background, and religions are coming together to protest. And because we are determined that we don't want to live under another military dictatorship. But of course, it's very devastating to see that peaceful protesters have been met with increased violence by the military. People are dying every day on the street, and children in my country are being shot in the head for protesting for the first time in their lives. More than 700 people, including many children, have been killed since the coup started. The military officially announced on state TV that they would shoot people in the head or the back if they come out to protest. The whole country is living in fear. They don't know when the soldiers will burst into their homes, shooting them, arresting them, or killing them. Since 1st of February, there are more than 3,400 political prisoners, political detainees in Burma. The figure is growing every day because the arrests continue every day. And we don't know how many people have simply disappeared in ethnic areas because there's no way to find out with the internet blackout in the country. And while we look into the patterns of arrest in the country, we see that there are two types of arrests going on. One is targeted arrest for individuals like Aung San Suu Kyi, President Wilkin, and other influential leaders and other interfaith activists and writers. But at the same time, the military is grabbing and arresting anyone, everyone they see on the street daily, every night and every day. Just yesterday, one of my friends was grabbed on the way. He was going out to buy tea and he was arrested and he was beaten. And now we heard that he's been sent to insane prison. All his crime was being on the street, going out to buy tea for his grandmother. He didn't even protest. So we are seeing all those arrests going on every day. And most of the people who've been arrested, we don't know where they're being detained. And most of them haven't been charged. My dad was arrested on 1st of February. And for 2 months, we had no idea where he was being detained or how he was. After 2 months, we found out that he's been sent to insane prison in Yangon, and he has been charged with hate speech. It makes me smile because my father is someone who promotes peace and interfaith and reconciliation in Burma. So that's, this is the evidence that they are charging people with politically motivated charges. And trials are being held inside prison at the moment. It's for security reasons, and only some lawyers are even allowed to go inside. And they are worried to go inside as well because they think they would be arrested. But lawyers continue to risk their lives, so they go inside to prison to represent their clients. But trials in Burma are just formalities. We know almost everyone would be sentenced under these politically motivated charges. And no families or public are allowed to attend the trial. It breaks my heart because the first time I saw my father was through iron bars in insane prison when I was 4 years old. This is his third arrest. It breaks my heart because I know so many other children are now going through what I went through, growing up without knowing when they will see their parents again and not knowing where their parents are. And we know that some families don't even know where their loved ones are being detained. And there are many cases of torture, sexual harassment, and death in detentions are going on. So it makes the family really worried. When I spoke to some families, they're saying the sad reality is they're saying they prefer to have their loved ones in prison rather than in integration center and being tortured for questioning. No one should have to choose between prison and integration center, but that's the sad reality in Burma at the moment. And doctors, nurses, and other professionals who are involved in civil disobedience movements are under increased pressure to go back to work or face arrest. If they face arrest, their license will be revoked and they will have criminal records after imprisonment. So that will make it impossible for them to go back to their work after their release. It is not only in the city areas that arrests and killings are happening. In ethnic states, fighter jets are bombing and killing civilians nearly every day. There are reports of airstrikes today in Karen state as well. In the past 10 years, under the reform process, ethnic people in ethnic states didn't see any changes or any improvement. In reality, conflicts have increased in ethnic areas. And at the moment, there is a growing numbers of internally displaced people in Karen and Kachin state, and they don't have shelter, food, or medical equipment. And children have no schools to go to, and they are living in fear. I don't have the technical expertise to know what kind of guns the military is using to kill people in Burma, or what kind of planes they are using to drop bombs on villages. But I know that almost every weapons and every items of military equipment and technology the Burmese military have comes from other countries or is based on technology from other countries. I believe around 41 countries have arms embargoes. That means 151 countries around the world do not have an arms embargo or policies to prevent the sales of equipment to the military or equipment, the technology that can be used for repression. Arms embargo should include weapons, military trucks, and other equipment that can be used to monitor and track citizens. We know that now the military have tracking technology to trace activists before arresting them. Burmese military do not need more weapons to kill people in Burma. And please work with the like-minded states to build a global coalition of countries imposing arms embargoes. In this way, regardless of China's veto at the UN Security Council, you can make a progress towards a global arms embargo. We need smart and targeted sanctions on military companies. Now that military is the government, revenues from oil, gas, timber, and jams needs to be stopped. The military won't be using these money to build schools or hospital or to help people. They are going to be using this revenue money to buy more weapons to oppress the country. Myanmar calculated that he could get away with staging a coup because so far they've been getting away with the genocide against Rohingya. And Myanmar and the Burmese military have that sense of impunity, and we need to end that by holding them accountable. And please refer Burma to ICC, International Criminal Court. We are very grateful to receive statements and letters of condemnations and action from the international community. And we are asking for you to help more, because we know there are much more that you can do to help people in the country. We want to live in a country where we don't have to worry about getting arrested or getting killed for speaking out. We want our children to go to school without having to worry about their school being bombed. We want to live in a free country, peaceful country with federal values, dignity, and equality. Despite ongoing violence, people in Burma are very courageous. They keep coming out on the street to protest. They even write their blood types on their arms in case they're injured or in case they're killed. Military violence hasn't stopped them from speaking out, because we are determined that we can do, and we will do, and we are doing everything we can to bring down this military. Archbishop Desmond Tutu has supported our struggle, and he once told us that everything that can be done must be done. If you haven't done everything you can, then you haven't done enough. So there are many measures that you can take to help us: diplomatic, economic, humanitarian, and legal. Please do everything you can, and please use those measures to help us win our freedom. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hui Nin, for sharing your experiences and your insights with us today. It's really a powerful reminder of what's happening outside of these meetings and outside of these screens, and something that we need to be cognizant of as ATT stakeholders move ahead with their communications and their deliberations and debates on how to implement the ATT more effectively. Thank you so much. I'll now turn to our last speaker today, Mr. Patrick Wilkin of Amnesty International. Patrick has over a decade of experience working on international human rights, most recently related to the trade in arms and security equipment. His work has covered diversion of small arms in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, illegal arms brokering in the UK, the trade in torture equipment, and the human rights responsibilities of the defense sector. He previously worked as a researcher on human rights in Brazil and currently heads Amnesty International's Business, Security, and Human Rights team at the International Secretariat in London. Today, Patrick will discuss the range of weapons used in past atrocity crimes and the present crackdown in Myanmar. He will also discuss reported recent transfers of military equipment to the Myanmar military and how states parties to the ATT can ensure that no military equipment or assistance reaches Myanmar. Following Patrick's remarks, we'll begin to take questions. You're welcome to put questions into the Q&A now, and we will take those and prepare those for the Q&A session. Please, again, use the Q&A function as well. Without further ado, I will introduce Patrick. Patrick, you have the screen. Thank you.
Thanks, Cindy, and thank you very much to all my fellow panelists, and particularly Ambassador Lin, and the last passionate intervention by Hui Nin, which I really think brings home the stakes of this situation, where there's courageous protests underway, but severe repression carried out by a very wide range of conventional weapons. And it just underlines the necessity, or the urgent necessity, of a complete UN security arms embargo, which, I totally support the various statements already today to that effect. I think what I wanted to do was just to quickly look at the arms dimension. Just to start with the range of weapons that are being used in Myanmar. used completely irresponsibly to carry out atrocities and grave human rights crimes. We've seen, as many of the other panelists have noted, over many years, decades, the Myanmar military has been misusing conventional arms for human rights violations, and we don't really need to go back many years to the Rohingya crisis, where we saw that the military were using a very wide range of small arms and light weapons, attack helicopters, armored vehicles, to commit and facilitate atrocity crimes, and they included the firing of fleeing civilians, the burning of houses with people still inside them, horrific sexual crimes, violent sexual acts, and including rape against women and girls, and also torture and ill treatment in detention. And we've seen some of the same units in operation in cities and towns across Myanmar, using heavy military equipment that is totally inappropriate for law enforcement, with sort of indiscriminate attacks on protesters, peaceful protesters, unarmed protesters, which is a horrific violation of multiple human rights. And we've also seen, as Wainin noted, the use of combat aircraft and flying sorties over various regions and attacking villages. So everything from small arms through to helicopters, combat aircraft and armoured weapons is in use today, and has been in use for years, used to commit and facilitate these violations. So moving on to the Arms Trade Treaty and transfers of equipment into Myanmar, I think we could start by saying a positive statement that the bulk of the states parties and signatories to the Arms Trade Treaty do have arms embargoes in place, and have had arms embargoes for many years, some dating back to the 1990s. But there are still some states supplying or who have recently supplied equipment to Myanmar. And I just wanted to briefly go through these publicly reported recent transfers into Myanmar, and then in with a couple of observations. So looking at the states parties to the HET, we see that Serbia has recently reported, albeit small quantities of artillery systems and small arms in the latest report to the HET. There's been a recent transfer in 2019 by South Korea of an amphibious military transport ship to Myanmar, and we have also observed some less lethal equipment, Korean less lethal equipment in use, although we understand that Korea has since ceased these supplies. Looking at China, the most recent state party to the HET, we welcome China's presence in the treaty body. We're very interested to see the interventions and interesting comments that China has already made in its participation with events so far this week. But we also note that China has been a long-standing exporter of military and dual-use equipment to Myanmar, and that has included combat aircraft, naval weapons, armoured vehicles, and surveillance drones, and that China plays a very strong role in Myanmar's indigenous naval industry. And this, the technology transfer comes in here, which I think is important. And finally, Chinese weapons have been seen in the hands of armed groups in border areas, although the chains of custody here is always difficult to ascertain and is unclear. So, I mean, we look forward to engaging with China as a state party to the ATT and discussing their future arms transfer policy and practice, and how that will meet China's new human rights obligations as a state party to the ATT, particularly under Articles 6 and 7, and how these legally binding human rights provisions might change China's current export policy and practice, and not just in the case of Myanmar, but there are other countries of concern. So looking at the signatories to the Arms Trade Treaty that have reported recent transfers, we can, and just remembering that the signatories have agreed not to undermine the treaty's object and purpose, and that includes contributing to international regional peace, security and stability, and reducing human suffering, to extremely important and relevant ideas to the current situation in Myanmar. So Ukraine has reported exports of armoured vehicles into Myanmar, and is also involved in a joint production of armoured vehicles. And Israel has supplied frigates, armoured vehicles, police training, and only stopped supplying when it was blocked by a Supreme Court ruling, which it vigorously contested. And then just finally, moving outside the states, parties and signatories to states, to non-states, to states outside the treaty body. Clearly, we have supplies from India, Turkey, and especially Russia. So Turkey has provided shotguns and shotgun cartridges. India, armoured vehicles, troop carriers, naval equipment, and Russia is clearly, a key military ally and supporter of Myanmar, and provides the backbone of the Myanmar Air Force, which, as we've seen, has been in operation and probably will be in operation in the future. So just to round up with just a couple of thoughts. I mean, I think first and foremost, I just wanted to reinforce what has been said by all the other panelists, that we urgently need to stop any further arms and military equipment and dual-use equipment that can be used for internal repression getting into Myanmar at this critical juncture. And the most effective way to do that is to adopt and implement a comprehensive UN Security Council arms embargo that covers not just military equipment, but policing equipment and dual-use equipment and training and technology transfers, which I agree are vital in a country that has domestic production, but that does rely on external technology for that production. And in the absence of leadership from the Security Council, states must, if they haven't already done so, impose and implement their own embargoes. The second point I would make is that, clearly, given the situation in Myanmar and the dynamics of the developing crisis, diversion is a key threat and risk, and states which already have arms embargoes need to act with extreme caution in terms of transfers to neighbouring states. The Myanmar's borders are porous, and many of those border areas have ethnic armed groups operating in them. So that's key, but also it's key that states are ultra cautious when supplying weapons to states that have in the past shown willingness to export to Myanmar. And here the illustrative case is Turkey, which Turkey has exported shotguns and cartridges, as I mentioned. And we have found in the protests, some of those cartridge casings were produced by an Italian-French company, Cheddite, which transferred those casings in the first instance to Turkey, and they were re-exported and have turned up in amongst the protests. And finally, I think we need to face the fact that this is not just an internal crisis in Myanmar, and it does not just threaten the long-suffering Myanmar people and who are courageously rising up against this repression, but it is a regional issue, and that underlines again the necessity to stop all arms and policing equipment transfers into Myanmar, lest we deepen what is already a regional crisis and trigger a full-blown human rights and humanitarian crisis across the entire region. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for your presentation. I think noting some of the specifics about what's happening with the weapons is particularly, I think, useful for this audience coming out, most of us coming from the ATT working group sessions, and really provides an understanding of, from the weaponry, where states parties need to focus their attention. And clearly, I think the point has been made by all panelists that truly a global arms embargo at this stage is really essential. I want to invite everyone to submit questions and answers. I have a couple of questions that I can start out with, which I will, but please do submit your questions and we will get to those as well. The first question I have are from the panel is, or from the participants are, who are, if you know, I think this would be to Patrick, who are the top 3 arms suppliers to Myanmar in the past years? And I'll couple that with another question that we have, which is, does Myanmar have its own weapons industry, or is it reliant on international transfers? Patrick, I will put that to you, and then in case if anyone else wants to answer, that's fine too, but I'll put it to Patrick first. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Cindy. I mean, I'd start by saying that as anyone who's worked in this area knows, it's not transparent, the international arms trade, particularly when dealing with countries like Myanmar. But from what has been reported, I think it's clear that Russia and China are the key military allies and suppliers of Myanmar, and we've also seen strong transfers from other countries such as India. I think, yeah, in terms of the domestic industry question, yes, Myanmar does have a strong domestic industry. It makes small arms, usually copying models from other countries. It also has a naval industry and manufactures its own military ships in cooperation with China. And I think it is a key issue that while it does have some capability, it requires input from other countries, and also it requires the raw material of other models of weapons to copy and to
Thank you, Patrick. I appreciate that that full response. I will have another question for the panel. Hold on just one second. One of the questions that was posed was, how do you think a UN Security Council embargo could ever be voted given its composition. And I think taking that question that we have, I'd also like to kind of add into that, given its composition as well, and given struggles that the UN Security Council has had with regard to a lot of situations around the world that involve atrocity crimes, what can the ATT community here do in the event that the UN Security Council is unable to act in this space? So I will let, who wants to take the floor first? I'll give it to Patrick first, and then we can go around the room. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's true that the UN Security Council often struggles to come up with consensus on some of these issues, and we see it. We've seen it in many critical situations in terms of arms transfers. So the other emblematic case being weapons transferred for use in Yemen. There was some action on the Houthi side, but there could never be a full embargo on Gulf states supplying the conflict in Yemen. In this case, yes, there are clearly political obstacles from some members of the council, but I think what has been mentioned, what is true. States supporting an embargo can play a role in trying to press for that embargo and to make representations to other states that maybe more want to block. And I think the situation is just so critical in Myanmar, and it threatens not just the country, as I mentioned, but the entire region. And I think there needs to be a concerted effort, concerted push. It's not easy given the composition of the council, as was mentioned, but there needs to be a full concerted diplomatic effort to make this happen.
Thank you, Patrick. Would anyone else like to respond to that question? Ambassador?
Okay, thank you. I'm not so sure I'm the right person to answer these questions.
Okay, no problem. I wasn't. No problem. I wasn't sure if you were nodding or not. Very good.
From my experiences working in the Security Council a long time ago, even though the composition of the Security Council is 15 countries, but it is not a secret. The P5 has the leading the responsibilities. So it's really important to politically how those 5 countries are going to coordinate among themselves.
Thank you so much. If there are no other responses, I'll move on to next set of questions. There's a question in the chat from Rob Perkins. It is to Patrick. It says, Patrick, you referenced the need to be cautious about possible diversion to Myanmar. What are the main red flags that should be considered by ATT states parties in your view? He mentions that you mentioned exports to states that have proved open to re-exporting in the recent past as one. Have you seen any reporting of diversion other than the shotgun cartridges? Patrick?
Yeah, I mean, it's an excellent question. In terms of the equipment being used currently in the repression, that we haven't seen any other instances of diversion just recently, but clearly there is a long history of diversion of weapons to ethnic armed groups in border areas. And there needs to be, as I mentioned, I think, any exports to countries bordering Myanmar and to countries willing to export on to Myanmar must be red flags for exporter states. And I think, there's the risks also increase of diversion we've seen across the world when the situation deteriorates and there's a greater fluidity between the armed forces and this patchwork of armed groups, not just the ethnic armed groups fighting for autonomy, but also armed groups that support the military regime. So there's bound to be fluidity across the border and within the country, and so there needs to be, you know, heightened attention to these risks.
Thanks so much, Patrick, for that response. Moving on to another question. Here it is. From a panel, from the participants. And the question is, what kind, I think it's to the whole panel, what kind of motivations do you see as promoting the regional hesitation to react? And if you think this overlaps with the motivations of fueling the lower rates of ATT accession in Asia. I'll open it to anyone who wants to sort of jump in first. Thanks.
Maybe I will. I think for the regional countries, I think everyone's being looking at the issue in Myanmar as a internal issue. Even, you know, China call the what's happening inside the country as an internal issue. But what we have to realize is that there is a huge humanitarian crisis going on because of the situation inside. There are a lot of IDPs in Thai-Burma border and along the borders area. And it's not only the ethnic internally displaced people, but also activists and people from central Burma are fleeing to escape arrest. And they are arriving in those borders area with very little or no, you know, clothing or personal items at all. So we are going to see a huge humanitarian crisis in the coming days, which is very worrying for us. And it was, for some people inside the country, it was encouraging that ASEAN did a summit last week, but very disappointing to see that they invited Myanmar to attend the ASEAN summit, which shouldn't happen because we have a legitimate government, that democratically elected government in the country, but Myanmar was giving a podium to talk about his propaganda. And even after the discussion, the point that came out from ASEAN didn't include, they didn't call for the release of all political detainees in the country, and they are trying to promote dialogue. How can we achieve dialogue while Myanmar and the military keep arresting oppositions, and most of the oppositions are in prison or in hiding? So I think we need to start seeing what's happening in the country as not an internal issue. It's a humanitarian crisis, and it will impact the regional politics and geopolitics in surrounding area as well. So I think we need to realize that.
Thank you, Huinin, for that response. Appreciate it. Moving on to another question. The one question is, and this is sort of I feel like is one of the questions that I think ATT stakeholders struggle with quite a bit. But it's the question ultimately is, what can the referencing the fact that China is a large exporter of weapons to Myanmar, what can the ATT do with regard to these exports and with regard to China? And I think I'll open that to the panel. Maybe Patrick has something. I know you had mentioned China and how the ATT can influence their arms exports. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, as I said, it's very positive that China is, has opted to become a state party to the ATT, and has opted to bind itself to the obligations in Articles 6 and 7. And I think, as all the presentations that we've heard today, reinforces the fact that the situation in Myanmar falls squarely under Article 6 of the treaty, and has done so for many, many years. And I think many countries have come to this conclusion independently, even before the creation of the Arms Trade Treaty. I think if there is, we've talked in the past about other difficult cases for the treaty body, the whole situation in the Gulf and Yemen. And I think there has been a struggle to have consensus, although there was, I think, a progressive consensus over how, what arms transfers were appropriate in that whole Gulf situation, and many states parties came to the conclusion that that those arms transfers were not appropriate. I feel that Myanmar is a much, much clearer example, a crystal clear example in my mind, given the level of atrocity, the patterns of abuse, the very, very long-term situation, and the extreme risks of exporting to Myanmar now. And I think that sort of really the treaty body has to be more proactive in building a consensus, that an agreement that any transfer into Myanmar is a breach of the treaty, and should work together with all states parties, including China, to build that consensus, and to really see the impact of the treaty on the ground. I mean, the question that has bedeviled the Arms Trade Treaty has been, how to interpret Article 6 and 7, particularly 7, in terms of, risk assessments, different states taking different positions on risk assessments and the risks that weapons will be used for human rights violations. I think if the treaty body cannot come to a conclusion regards Myanmar, then there is something quite fundamentally wrong there, because it is a totally clear example in my mind. A transfer from a state party into Myanmar is a completely clear breach of the terms of the treaty in my mind.
Ambassador.
Yes, I just point out, for example, at the treaty implementation working group, our mandate is the assisting the states through the discussions and exchange of the views, that in practical implementation of the treaty at the national levels. So these are the main the areas of the focus of my the working groups. So this process, we can help the state parties and others having the further better understanding about the implementation of the treaty. So that's what I'm trying to emphasize. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick, and thank you very much, Ambassador. You've actually anticipated the next question, which was, how might states parties use the ATT formal process, including this week's preparatory meetings, to advance the cause of restricting arms transfers, generally speaking, and specifically with regard to Myanmar? You point out that there are within the working group on effective treaty implementation, a focus on Article 6 and Article 7 and the interpretations and applications there too. And I think just taking my moderator's privilege here, I think what I would encourage from Control Arms perspective is more conversation about specific situations such as the one in Myanmar inside the ATT working groups, in addition to considering the policies and the interpretations and the applications of the treaty itself, which are also obviously critical to making an impact and to making a difference in strengthening the regulation of conventional arms transfers all over the world. With that, I think we have one more question so far, and the question is about civil society. Dr. Balkrishna Kirby from India writes, thanking the panelists, but especially with regard to the on-the-ground situation. Dr. Kirby's organization is working in Northeast India, and they have many armed non-state actors who procure illegal arms through Myanmar. Rightly saying that many companies are selling weapons to Myanmar. Their question is if you could highlight how civil society could work with regard to this issue.
Thanks, Cindy. Yes, I mean, I think there are serious issues in that region, and I think I mean, one thing, in a sense, that if you are based in India, I think one thing that civil society and disarmament groups across the world can do is to try and pressure their own governments to both cease licensing arms transfers to Myanmar, which India appears to be continuing to do, but also the states taking proper action to stop illegal flows of weapons across border areas, and you know that's a grave responsibility on in this situation where there's fluidity in the movement of arms across borders. I mean, it's very difficult if the problem is on the Myanmar side of the border to see what can be done to call on the Myanmar authorities to or areas that are controlled by armed groups to act. But this only underlines the urgent need for you know, no further arms to enter to Myanmar, and to try and staunch the flow of arms that are fueling violations. But it is a very complex and difficult problem, the illicit flow of arms across remote borders. That is often very difficult to control and requires you know, concerted action and you know, proactive action on the part of the states controlling the border areas.
Thanks, Patrick, for that response. I appreciate it. A question for Hui Nin. Are civil society organizations still active in Myanmar, or has it simply become too dangerous? There's a question. Thank you.
Thank you. Some of them are still operating in hiding, and they're still trying to raise awareness, but most of them are trying to escape arrest, so they can't really operate, and also there is no internet or Wi-Fi inside the country, so for their safety and also for the technical difficulties is becoming more and more difficult. Even a couple of days ago, the Assistant Association for Political Prisoners is the main organization helping political prisoners, finding lawyers and finding legal issues in the country and documenting arrest. They've been declared as illegal organization by the military, so their family members and their staff members are in danger as well. So most of my friends I work with and who work for civil society organizations are either in hiding or in prison at the moment. But some are still trying to operate as much as they can and trying to get the information out, but it's becoming more and more difficult every day.
Thank you. More questions are coming in. One question is with regard to the European Union. The question is simply, where is the EU in this? I think to translate that question would be, I think, what is the European Union position on Myanmar? If anyone on the panel can elaborate on that, understanding that no one on the panel is from the EU. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I can, speaking in my, from London on the outskirts of the EU, I can say that, the EU has had, as I mentioned, an arms embargo, and quite a comprehensive arms embargo since the 1990s. It has been strengthened and extended to equipment used for internal repression. What I could say is that there have been the odd transfer that has raised eyebrows on this sort of skirting the embargo, and there was a case of UAVs, unmanned aircraft from surveillance aircraft from Austria that was apparently transferred for non-military purposes, but ended up on military ships. So, again, there has to be huge caution around, particularly any assurances that Myanmar might be giving on the use and end use of equipment, because we have seen that that is not always the case, and things are repurposed for military use or use in repression.
Thank you. A follow-up question to that, a couple of questions on specific weapons in use in Myanmar. One question is, has Myanmar been an ongoing user of landmines, and does the military continue to lay new landmines? And secondarily, how could the ATT address the sales of dual-use equipment like UAVs and drones to the Myanmar military? Patrick, you seem to be on the hot seat today, so I appreciate your attention and these are tough questions. I want to thank everybody for the tough questions, and I think we all appreciate Patrick fielding these with such skill. Thank you.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, we have seen the laying of landmines historically, and we've seen, as I mentioned during the Rohingya crisis, the use of quite powerful Russian manufactured models that, yes, they're internationally banned and horrific weapons to be using in any circumstances, and particularly laying them in the path of fleeing refugees. So there is a long history of landmine use. As to the question on dual-use goods and the arms trade treaty, I mean, I think that, as has been often noted, that, there is sort of the scope of Article 2 in terms of the conventional weapons that the treaty covers, but there is also an understanding that that is a minimum, that's a floor, not a ceiling, and that states should really apply the treaty to the widest possible range of conventional weapons. We also have the Wassenaar arrangement that covers some surveillance equipment and dual-use regulations in the EU. So there are other avenues. But I think what's important from a sort of principled and philosophical point of view is that the end use is the key. And, in some ways, we see this in my other branch of work on the torture trade. You can list possible types of weapons, but in the end, the concern is the human rights violation. The concern is their use. So, anything that we can see that is being flagrantly misused, if the states parties to the Arms Trade Treaty want to apply the spirit of the treaty, then they should be concerned about any goods, whether military or dual use, that are being used for violations of international human rights law.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for that response. I have one other one question that I think is one more to Patrick, and it hopefully will be a short answer. And then what I will do is allow for each of the panelists to have some closing remarks. So the last question is there any study on the source of munitions in Myanmar? And I think Patrick might have a response to that.
On the source of munitions, I mean, there has been some previous work. I'm not sure whether I'm aware of specific studies on munitions. There are clearly some domestically made munitions in terms of small arms ammunition, yeah, I'm not sure whether there's been a recent study on tracing munitions, but what we have done as an organisation, we've been reacting to the crisis situation and looking at what we can find in terms of equipment that is being used in specific instances of violations. And that equipment, there has been some Chinese small arms. There's also been a large range of domestically produced small arms modelled on well-known different types of small arms from China and Israel as well. So there is a lot of domestic production. I'm not sure whether there's been a systematic study recently. No.
Great, thank you so much. So I'll now turn to, we'll do it, Patrick, in reverse order. So we'll start with Patrick, then we'll go to Wei Nin, and then we'll go to Ambassador Lim for any closing remarks you may want to make. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd just like to briefly say that, I totally agree with Ambassador Lin's opening remarks that what is key for the ATT is for it to have actual concrete impact on the ground. And for the ATT to have concrete impact on this issue, there needs to be, as I mentioned before, consensus that it is unacceptable for states parties under the treaty to export military equipment to Myanmar. And I think also states parties, the ATT, given their commitment to Articles 6 and 7, should press diplomatically for the UN Security Council to take strong positions on this, including the comprehensive UN Security Council arms embargo, which is urgently needed given the gravity of the situation.
Thank you. Wei Nin?
Thank you again for organising this event, especially is a very important issue for us to be talking about. I hope, from what we've said in the last hour or so, cover the fact that what's going on, what happened against the Rohingya in 2017 and what's going on inside the country is more than evidence that the Burmese military is using what they have in terms of weapon-wise or their power to attack their own people rather than defending the country, like they like to call it. So I hope that ATT state parties will follow the guidelines and treaties and use their influence to make the global embargoes, global arms embargoes happen. And I really appreciate this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Wei Nin. And lastly, Ambassador Lim.
Thank you. Today, I am participating in my personal capacity as chair of UGT. But my country, Korea, was mentioned in the presentation. I feel obliged to clarify. The Korean government has suspended new exchanges and cooperation in the field of defense and security with Myanmar by prohibiting the export of military supplies and strictly controlling the export of dual-use items to the country. And back to the ATT, I want to say that the ATT provides various opportunities through the CSP cycle to review the mechanism and improve it. 3 working groups, including my working group, UGT, also thematic discussions or newly established divergent information exchange forum will be a good examples. But nothing can be perfect. That at the end, it's our shared responsibility to make the ATT working the more effectively. That's the message I'd like to convey. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And I just want to close by thanking the panelists for your time and energy to join this panel, share your views and experiences, and with your work in terms of trying to end the violence in Myanmar. I want to just highlight one point that Ambassador Lim has just made with regard to perfection. He says nothing can be perfect. I think it's important to remember that in the ATT, as we strive as ATT stakeholders, states, parties, signatories, observers, and civil society and industry alike, we need to work together to raise the standard from what it is today. There have been recent changes in policies of ATT states parties to limit or re-examine arms transfers. Ambassador Lim just stated one of those in his own country. We also see other re-examinations happening with regard to transfers to the Saudi coalition for use in the Yemen war, and these are just starting to come in the last few months, and I believe them to be quite late in the game from a personal perspective. However, they are long-awaited steps in the right direction. More and more drastic changes are needed still. We know that unchecked arms flows provide fuel to situations of conflict and armed violence. And today, as the rest of the panelists have done, we do encourage all states parties to the ATT, and those who have yet to join, to review their policies and practices with regard to arms sales that reach conflict areas like Myanmar, Yemen, and Syria, to ensure that they do not contribute or exacerbate these crises that affect so many around the world. Again, it takes courage. It takes small steps to get to the big steps, and we encourage dialogue. And of course, civil society organizations are here in support of the ATT and of the ATT states parties. Thank you, everyone, for taking time to attend this side event. We will see you those of you who are attending the working groups, we'll see you in session tomorrow. Have a wonderful day, a wonderful evening. Thank you so very much.